Thanks so much for making time today to join us either live or on demand. My name is Kimberly Newbury, and I'm responsible for the commercial side of our business at North Star's Global Travel Technology Group, of which PhocusWright and PhocusWire are a part. We're all committed to pursuing gender equity in the travel industry, and we've been working hard for many years to do that through our research. Our research is really our guide, and part of the effort that we have put forward for gender equity is in looking at professional development for women, mentorship through our PhocusWright Connects program, in-person sessions during our live events that bring people together around the topic, and a really robust editorial focus throughout the year in PhocusWire. Our editorial and content team really shines a light on initiatives that are oriented around women's leadership. And we're very mindful of including women and a diverse group of speakers on stage at our events. The PhocusWright gender equity results for 2021 that we will be presenting today are part of a global effort that has been at the center of our practice for many years. Thanks to all of you who took the time to fill out the survey and participate in that, and who kept in contact with us about the different kinds of efforts that you've made within your own companies or within the industry to forward women's leadership. We really appreciate it. It helps us with our editorial content and to share some visibility on the topic with the entire industry. It's important at both local and global levels. So thank you for that. Here's our agenda today. We'll be moving reasonably quickly through all of these great things with a presentation from my colleague, and then moving on to a panel discussion and a little Q&A in between. We're delighted to welcome Coney Dongre, our Senior Research Analyst at PhocusWright, to share the results of the Gender Equity Study for 2021 with you. We'll follow her presentation, as I said, with some Q&A by our very own Jill Menze, who's an editor on PhocusWire, and a panel discussion including Simon Gallow from UN Women, and Carrie Kaplan-Gerb from Go City. I'm personally really curious to see what's changed since the last time we fielded this study back in 2019 to now, especially with the impact of the pandemic, the great resignation, the disproportionate impact of COVID on women's careers, especially in travel and especially women of color. We have a lot to discuss today, and we've experienced some massive changes that have turned our world upside down since 2020. And Coney is here to share the data and the implications for the Gender Equity in Travel Study PhocusWright commissioned for 2021. So Coney, please tell us what we've learned.
Thank you, Kimberly. And hello, everyone. Welcome to the presentation and discussion on gender equity in travel. The big question is, are we there yet? Well, spoiler alert, the answer is no. So the issue of gender diversity is important. This discussion is important, and for one basic reason. Every person, every human has the right to be treated equally and to have equal opportunities to realize their full potential and contribute to the development of their communities and their country. Gender inequality is hidden in plain view within the travel, tourism, and hospitality industry. Our goal is to get the discussion going and help accelerate our industry's transition to a better and more equal future for us all. As Kimberly mentioned, PhocusWright has conducted the diversity study even earlier. This is our third time doing it in 2021. Earlier, we did it in 2019, and before that in 2018. As we all agree that 2020 and 2021 were not normal years. So when we did the study this time around, we were interested in not only understanding the differences versus 2019, but understanding how the pandemic has impacted gender equity in the industry, how COVID-19 has impacted women's lives, careers, and their representation in leadership in the corporate world. Where progress was clearly needed to be made before 2020, evidence suggests that the onset of COVID-19 has reversed many of the incremental gains of recent years. According to World Economic Forum's 2021 Global Gender Gap Report, the length of time until men and women are truly equal has increased from 99.5 years to 135.6 years, which means that another generation will have to actually wait to see men and women being equal. And this is what our survey respondents breakout looks like. The 2 in 3 of the participants were female, so probably we need to work on our gender equity. When we look at the breakup by company size, 1 in 2 worked in smaller companies that had less than 50 people. 10% respondents were for companies that employed more than 10,000 people globally. 1 in 4 respondents identified themselves as part of executive leadership team. And when we look at different age groups, the largest share, that is 46% of respondents, were more than 55 years old. In the past few years, the discussion around gender issues in the workplace has grown from a low-level rumble to a steady roar, though, of course, a lot of work needs to be done. 37% of survey respondents feel that gender equity is very important and needs immediate action. When we asked what the importance of the discussion around gender equity and women's leadership is as we emerge from the pandemic, overall, 36% responded that the issue is even more critical now. And the share of women who agree with this is twice that of men. There are some clear differences in perception of men and women and people from different age groups about this issue. Women and younger people feel it is more urgent. If we dig deeper, we see that the share of women who feel that this issue is critical and needs to be acted upon immediately is 46%, which is more than twice that of men. Another noteworthy finding here is a much higher share of 18 to 34-year-old, which is 57%, believe in the importance and urgency of the issue compared to 40% of 35 to 54-year-olds and just 30% of those 55 plus. This likely indicates that senior folks in the industry are comfortable with status quo. They've gotten used to the industry being less gender equitable, whereas relatively newer entrants would want to see a more equitable and fair industry. Let's look at the current state of the travel industry. When asked to rate the travel industry with respect to gender equity for career development and management opportunities, 34% rated the industry good or excellent. And this is 6 percentage points higher than 2019. So at least some progress is being made. But these are baby steps. Women have a lot less favorable outlook than men. 68% rate the travel industry adequate or below. And for men, it's only 46% who rate it below adequate. In contrast, only 26% of women rate the industry good or excellent, compared to 46% of men. There is this clear trend that stands out in our research findings. It's that a substantially lower share of women than men feel positively about the opportunities and support available to them to rise to leadership positions in the travel industry. And this is likely because women personally experience those glass ceilings, those roadblocks along the way, and the challenges they need to overcome to work despite all responsibilities. 59% men and just 29% women believe that all employees have equal access to leadership opportunities. The share of men who agree with this statement has gone up compared to 2019, but the share of women has dropped. And this is true for the second statement as well. More than half of men and 26% women uh, agree that there is a clear available path for leadership cultivation. The difference, again, is huge. The question is, why is women representation in leadership so important? Why do we need to act persistently to achieve gender equity in leadership? Well, women represent half of world's population and therefore also half of its potential. Diversity brings manifold benefits to organizations, including greater profitability, increased creativity and innovation, and a happier workforce. It is good for business and it enables the sector to serve its client and stakeholders better. And most importantly, it is the right thing to do. When asked the reasons for cultivating gender equal leadership, a greater share of women believe that women enhance decision making and diversity of thought and knowledge. The rationale for a greater share of men than women is to bring about fairness and equality. So the difference is clear. Men want to do it because they want to bring about, because they want to be fair, whereas women believe that they bring more to the table. Here's a snapshot of how women are doing in the corporate world in the US. We see that at entry level, an equal number of women as men enter the corporate world. But as we move higher up the ladder, the ratio of women drops at every step. Women still lack enough representation at the top of the ladder. At the senior manager level, female representation stood at 35%. At the executive committee level, women occupied less than 1 in 4 positions. Again, an indicator of the work that needs to be done to equalize the gender imbalance in the top tier of business leadership. And if we look at the travel and tourism industry, that is one of the world's most gender diverse sectors, the number of women in executive roles, C-suite, or boards is still abysmally low. The World Tourism Lucerne and Aptamine's Gender Diversity Report found that women make up more than half of the global tourism workforce. But there is an invisible glass ceiling between senior management and the executive team, where 19% of roles are filled by women. Only 5% of the top 100 listed firms in travel, tourism, and hospitality are led by a female CEO, while 6 companies have a female chair of board. So the reason for having so few women at the top is promotions at the very first step up to manager are not equitable. This makes it nearly impossible for companies to lay a foundation for sustained progress at more senior levels. So if you have fewer women, you have fewer women to promote to the next level, and the gap keeps widening. These are some of the obstacles that people in the travel industry must overcome to rise to leadership positions. Absence of a plan is the most cited obstacle and a baking call for companies. More men than women feel that a lack of skills and training are major roadblocks to become leaders in the industry. However, women feel differently. More women believe that the bias among management and lack of work-life balance are major constraints. If we compare these numbers to 2019 findings, a smaller share mentioned absence of leadership plan as an obstacle. A greater share quoted biases, insufficient skills, and lack of work-life balance. Let's dig deeper into some of these issues. Talking about biases, gender bias is the most commonly cited obstacle. A study by UN Development Programme found that 90% of people are biased against women, and more than 40% believe that men make better business executives. The challenges of managing work, family, and domestic life simultaneously have literally hit home for millions of men and women across the world, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So it comes as no surprise that women are even more burned out than they were a year ago. And the gap in burnout between women and men, it has almost doubled. Women feel the constant pressure to work more, including needing to provide additional evidence of their competence at workplace. And this is one of the major reasons of burnout. While many organizations are working on promising solutions and have taken significant steps to address gender diversity, there are many that have scaled down such efforts. What is worrisome, as we see in this chart, the share of respondents who indicated that their organizations are taking no initiatives to increase gender diversity has more than doubled compared to 2019. A cause for concern, of course. So, what does it take to succeed in the travel sector? When asked about top skills needed in the travel industry and organizations in the future, complex problem solving and creativity came at the top. And there's not much difference between the ranking of skills required in the industry versus travel companies. But the importance of intangible skills has gone up substantially. More than 4 in 5 respondents feel that intangible skills are more important as the industry recovers from the pandemic. And these skills like creativity, teamwork, and innovation are associated more with women. For both men and women and people across all age groups, persuasion remains the most important business skill for succeeding in the travel industry, followed by persistence. And now let's move on to the last section, which is the COVID effect. Overall, more than half of the respondents feel that women's careers were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. But the good news is the pandemic has not had a big impact on the share of women in leadership positions. More than 3 in 5 respondents indicated that their company has the same proportion of women leaders as before the pandemic. And this is an encouraging sign and worth celebrating after an incredibly difficult year. For other organizations that have seen an increase in the share of women leaders, increased flexibility at work, and women's greater willingness to lead the organization or teams in turbulent times were cited as top reasons. Isn't that amazing? Women just rise up to the occasion. In organizations where the share of women in leadership has dropped, lack of work-life balance, burnout, and lack of support from workplace were quoted as top reasons. If we look at the overall impact of the pandemic, the story is a little different. Overall, 42% respondents feel that it has become difficult for women to rejoin workforce post-pandemic, with 54% women feeling this way. In a nutshell, what this means is more women have lost jobs and they think it will be difficult to re-enter the workforce. Compared with men, women managers are taking more consistent action to promote employee well-being, including checking in on their team members, helping them manage their workloads, and providing support for team members who are dealing with burnout or navigating work-life challenges. So it's amply clear that women are remarkable leaders. We know that this crisis is far from over. The risk to women and to the companies that depend on their contributions remains very real. So everyone in the travel sector needs to step up and contribute to building a more equitable industry. Now I'd like to invite Jill for a discussion.
Thanks, Coney. And yeah, so before we dive into a panel discussion to discuss these findings in more detail, I did want to ask you a couple questions. You know, you mentioned in one of the slides that organizations have downsized their efforts and initiatives to increase diversity. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what are the main reasons for this change?
Yes, COVID-19 has severely impacted organizations' effort to increase gender diversity and bring about gender equity in the workplace. If I quote our survey data, the share of survey respondents who said that their organizations have formal leadership or mentoring programs, have employee resource groups, or conduct race neutral and gender neutral resume review has declined compared to 2019. Mm-hmm. And what I believe is one of the major reasons for this is the COVID-19 pandemic. We all know it's no hidden fact that tourism businesses were really struggling when the pandemic hit, and many have not yet recovered. They are still, kind of struggling to just keeping afloat. So, amidst all this, survival became the top priority. And now, as we are kind of, recovering, the industry is coming out of the darkest phase, returning back to profitability will take precedence. So, with all these survival related things, profitability related things taking priority, gender diversity has kind of gone down in organizations' priority list.
Right. Yeah. Unfortunately, that kind of makes sense that they have to rethink their things, but it's unfortunate that this has gotten put to the side. So, but you do mention, travel did have this huge impact and a lot of jobs were lost. And we saw because of the pandemic that more women lost jobs than men. Do you have any data that speaks to what's being done to reverse that change? And, what are your thoughts on this overall?
Yes, gender diversity definitely has suffered a setback. And with women job loss rate 1.8 times that of men, and organizations laying off diversity enthusiasts, advocates, and professionals, it will be very difficult to build up gender diverse companies or teams. And our survey data shows that only 3 in 10 respondents have indicated that their companies are taking concrete actions to hire more women in the workforce. And this is alarmingly low. This means that 7 out of 10 companies are not doing much, not doing probably anything. So we all have to get back together. And I'd like to just add a quote from Peggy Berg here, who's the chair of Castle Project. The companies that perform best in the new post-pandemic market will be companies with diverse leadership.
Great. All right, Coney. Well, thank you so much for presenting that. And I'd like to bring out our panelists now to discuss these findings even further. So pleased to introduce Simon Gallow of UN Women UK and Carrie Keplinger of COO of Go City. So Simon and Carrie, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Thank you very much.
Great. So I just want to start with, we'll kind of get into the why in a bit, but, just having seen the presentation now, what one statistic jumped out at you the most?
I think I love all the data, by the way. Thank you, Coney, for presenting that. One of the statistics that stands out for me is of the female survey respondents, 63% were manager, director of above, and 25% identify themselves as executive leaders. I think that those statistics are really interesting. What I see in the industry really as a whole is that there are a lot of women in management positions. So they make it to that managerial spot. They're executing a lot of the day-to-day of the business. But there is a glass ceiling to move up beyond that. And I found that hard myself. And I think that's where we just need to keep pushing and having these discussions, leading with data, thinking about the ways that we can sort of understand this area better will help us to change that in the future. And I think that's a really important point of the data too, of the presentation.
Yeah. And Simon, your top statistic.
There were so many statistics that I've written down, and thank you, Coney, for not only kind of putting the data together, doing the survey and all the rest of it, but also presenting it so clearly. Data is the first point towards actually having proper tangible action. There were many different statistics I could pick out, on this occasion, the one that I'm going to pick out is the one that you've touched on, Jill, because I just wanted to mention this again. There has been an increase from 11% to 23% of organisations reporting to take no action in terms of equality. Now, the reason this stands out is because obviously that's not a good thing. Obviously, all of us on the call understand the importance of equality, particularly in times of crisis. But two, and most importantly, it stands as a direct contradiction to the other points that were made about how equality leads to greater profitability, greater talent, greater flexibility in the workplace, greater innovation, all of these points. And this is often one of the biggest problems when we talk about equality, is it's seen as a separate, siloed, distant thing, a problem for HR to fix, when in reality, diversity, inclusion, equality should be something that is strategic, something that is completely crucial to how you deliver your services. I'm sorry, I'm very cheekily going to mention one other statistic because it sort of links to that point, which is if you looked at the difference between what men and women thought the benefit of gender diversity was, the narrowest gap in those data points was on this piece, that gender equality ensures that you reflect the customer base. 21% of women agreed with that, 90% of men agreed that. That was the narrowest difference. And this is the point, is that if you have greater equality internally, if you properly represent the society and the communities within which you are serving, you will actually have a better business because you are delivering products and services that meet their needs. Actually, it's very, very simple. And so that is one of the key things that we need to prioritize when we return and build after the pandemic, is to understand equality is not some separate thing for HR to fix. It's a fundamental part of any business.
Absolutely. And, that kind of goes to a statistic that jumped out for me is that, 22% of men compared to 44% of women feel the issue of gender equality is even more critical now. That goes into exactly what you're saying. You first and foremost have to even believe it's critical to then even put it in the perspective of what you just mentioned. Does that surprise you, and that men feel it so much less than women? Does that surprise you at all, and why or why not? Carrie, let's start with you.
It doesn't surprise me. I think you can only see bias if you experience it. And obviously, there's varying levels of what your background is and how that would impact your ability to see bias or understand it. You have to do the hard work to see it otherwise. But I totally agree on all of these points. I think it's interesting to me that women are the majority of purchasers as well in travel. And so they're buying, they're also the ones doing a lot of the day-to-day inside of these organizations. And then they're held back from being at the table to make the decisions. And I think that's just crazy, really, if you think about it. So we have to keep pushing to make that change.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and just to build on those points, I have to say from my experience during the pandemic, I feel, and I can see I shouldn't be presumptuous in using my own internal biases, but I did have a quick look at the audience today, and it's great to see a real good level of diversity in the audience. I have to say the conversations, particularly with men in these spaces over the pandemic, I have felt in my role have become a lot easier. So whether that is men that are, for example, spending more time at home and go, oh my goodness me, now I understand why my wife or my partner has greater barriers to career progression because they have such a disproportionate burden of care at home, to topics, for example, around actually, some really serious topics like domestic abuse and violence. I do think there is clearly greater engagement and awareness on these issues. But the problem for me, and I know that we've sort of recognized this on the call, is something that is much deeper. It's much deeper. It's much more fundamental, that men must see themselves both as allies to women in breaking down some of those barriers, and they don't always recognize their role in that, but also that equality for women is progress for everyone. Right. Men included, women, men, and all genders. And there is a disconnect there that remains. And that's why when you look at that statistic about about men and women in terms of after the pandemic, there will continue to be that disparity.
Right, right. Another important stat that came up is that we're seeing, younger generations consider gender equity discussions more important. Carrie, as a senior leader in the travel industry, I want to ask you, how do we get more senior leaders to listen to this younger generation and to take into their concerns so that we can break that ladder that's keeping women from getting to the top?
Yeah, I mean, thankfully, I think the younger generation are going to be the majority of purchasers, or they already are on their way to being that demographic. And then that's when you start to be forced to think like that. And it's either you get on board and you start to understand the dynamics of the decision makers. That's what they are. They're making decisions for the industry. Or your business will fall apart. So I think hopefully there will be an organic move in that direction naturally, because younger people are more open-minded with this. But I think we have to, again, do the harder work to just understand, to do research like this, talk about it, get the word out, make sure that it's normalized to discuss within the industry. And that is another step we have to take along the way. Simon, yeah.
Yeah, Simon, anything to add on that?
No, I just
on the younger generation.
Yeah, no, I nothing too much to add. I completely agree. The only point that I just wrote down is I think it's also worth considering the influence that you can have, not only in terms of the customers, but there's other ways you can have influence that I think is particularly important to the industry. And that's, I've written down the 3 C's because we all love an alliteration, but, colleagues, clients, customers, and communities. And I think, you can have influence with your colleagues, particularly, reverse mentoring, I think internally is an important one for leaders to do, actually speak to younger people in the business and go, what am I doing wrong? Having that level of humility. Customers, doing the market analysis to understand the trends of young people, millennials, generation Z, Q, 1 through whatever it's called now, I don't know, but whatever it might be, to understand those trends. But also the other one that I was reflecting on was the communities and also contracts, as I've called them. So, within your supply chains, obviously, travel is often, deeply embedded in many supply chains. And actually you can have influence there. I'm not going to do business with you because clearly you don't have full representation. It's bad governance. It's ethically not what we agree with. So there's a lot of different ways that you can have influence and engage with young people across the value chain.
Yeah, absolutely. And another, we also saw the perception of leadership and the discrepancies there. For those tuning in today, what are some actionable steps that can be taken to make leadership opportunities simply more available and equally available to all employees? Carrie, do you want to start?
I was just reflecting on some of the changes that I see in my own organization. So we're moving to travel technology, and you can see that across the industry, really. So you have a lot of technology jobs coming in, which are using agile principles, which are less about leadership and more about team dynamics of decision making. And I think one of the things we're trying to do in our organization is bring that into other departments a little bit. So it's less about the leader making the decision all the time, and it's the collective team trying to help get to a decision-making process or provide recommendations that end up being actionable. So I feel like that's a really interesting opportunity for us as an industry. And it might be a shift that just happens anyway. And younger people are just more inclined to think that way, to work that way. That's more in line with the way that they interact with businesses. And going back to what Simon said, you have to take your employees and make sure that they all find their fit to make the business successful, right? That it works for them. So I think that's an interesting piece that would fall in line with this.
Absolutely. And Simon?
Yeah, I mean, I always find this a slightly difficult one because I could respond, and actually Coney's already mentioned lots of really interesting kind of things that you can do internally, initiatives, and many of you know them. And I can respond by telling you which ones work. So, for example, having kind of, target performance targets for managers is really important.
Yes.
As an example, whereas there are some that don't work as much. So for example, unconscious bias training online kind of generally goes in one ear and out the other. But there's those sorts of things to remember. But what I'd like to do is, again, just kind of take a step back and go, there's a few important principles that need to be considered. And just to mention two or three, the first one is leadership. And, leadership is talked about a lot. But what I mean by that is not just kind of role modeling good behaviors, not communicating in your newsletter or sending out a good tweet to show that you care about equality. What I mean by leadership is investing in this. Yes. Investing in this like any other commercial issue that you have. There is a business case, but you need to put both money into it and you need to put time into it. The amount of companies that I work with where diversity and inclusion is something that one employee will be doing as kind of a side hobby or hustle on the after work. I mean, that is just not what you would expect to do if you're bringing a new product to market. And the same shouldn't be the case for diversity and inclusion. The second one is around data. So properly understanding, gathering and interrogating the data and gathering in intersectional ways. So obviously women are not just like, women are not one homogenous group. Women come from very, very different places and they have diverse sexualities, abilities, ethnicities. But also in the travel industry, you are mobile, right? You work across the world and very, very culturally different. So understanding what some of those very nuanced local barriers are really, really important. And then the final one, just to mention, which I've already mentioned, but I want to hammer home again, is the kind of strategic alignment is a very unpleasant corporate term. But what I'm saying is, don't just bung this in HR. HR do an amazing job and have a huge role to play with this, particularly in terms of internal progression. But this needs to be something that sits at the top of an organization that reports into the CEO to understand how diversity, equality, and inclusion is something to consider both for colleagues, but also in terms of your customers and the communities within which you serve.
Yeah, that's an excellent point.
Yeah, go ahead, Jill.
No, go ahead. I said excellent point. Go on.
I was going to say, I agree with all of that. And I think a lot of travel industry businesses, and ours included, have struggled to provide those resources or be able to get to those resources when we're trying to manage pandemic landscape. But 100% spot on. All of that has to happen in order for any progress to happen and for a glass ceiling to be able to be pushed through. Yeah.
Yeah, and the thing is actually for me, the pandemic presents an opportunity. I mean, I can never imagine what your sector has gone through. I mean, it's just been a nightmare, over the past 2 years. But with sort of crises like this, and as I said, your sector's been on the kind of borne the brunt of it. There are opportunities. People think a bit differently. And actually, even the fact that, for example, that we're having this call virtually, I mean, this was just not something that would have been done. And guess who would have lost out? It would have been women who obviously have, caring responsibilities, etc., and need a little bit more flexibility. And so, there are actually opportunities to do things a bit differently. So we just have to use this window to grab them.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. So we've talked a bit about, the path to leadership, but, on that, we did lose so many jobs because of the pandemic. COVID's had a huge impact on women and women of color in particular. How can the travel industry better work to retain the talent that it has and not continue to lose it, and also bring back the women talent that it has lost and promote that? Simon, why don't we start with you? Oh, Simon.
Sorry. I was just finishing a note to myself. Retain the talent and bring some of the talent back. Again, there are multiple resources that I can share with you to give kind of practical toolkits and guides. Go to UN Women UK, drop me an email, all the rest of it. But the point that I would make is actually often this is like kind of over intellectualized or over corporatized about what we need to do in these situations. For me, there is a very simple message, which is listen, learn, and act. Listen to the experiences, listen to the voices of women in your organization and within your communities, what they're telling you, including through an intersectional lens. show the humility, and I'm particularly talking about men in positions of power, show the humility to learn from those experiences and don't presume you know best. And that can often be a challenge in particularly kind of centralized or hierarchical organizations where you make decisions really quickly and you do them in a kind of closed broom cupboard. So learn from those experiences, whether you're talking about kind of everything from menopause in the workplace to particular barriers that women of color have to particular issues around safety going to and from work or whatever it might be while traveling is another example, and then make clear commitments. Too often we see kind of slightly incoherent initiatives. I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, everything from we're going to host an International Women's Day event to we might mentor one or two people. No, have a very clear action plan that you are accountable for and you are going to deliver, and review it each year. And the final piece underpinning listen, learn and act is that it is not a moment. It is an ongoing piece of monitoring. Gender equality doesn't happen overnight. Challenges emerge all the time. And if you continue to listen, learn and act, and monitor on an ongoing basis, then you will probably be able to respond to your colleagues, your customers, and your communities.
Yeah. And Carrie, as someone who running a travel company that is impacted by the pandemic, can you speak a bit about retaining talent or bringing back talent that perhaps you've lost?
Yes. I mean, I think, obviously this is something I'm really close to. And when I see the leaders in our organization, and even in the businesses that I work with, there are women that just have been so critical to the success and the recovery for COVID. Every one of the leaders in my group, senior management, like in that category, are women actually. So what I've tried to do is spend a lot of time mentoring and supporting them and empowering them. I think empowerment's one of the most important steps in this. It's showing that you have the trust in their decision-making skills, helping to support their lifestyles because they are different sometimes. Mm-hmm. I've always been a very big advocate for flex hours, and I've always found that our team's more productive when I give them more flexibility, when we have more flexibility. We all have kids and things like that. So we try to just acknowledge that, and we talk about it openly and honestly, and work through it. So totally agree with Simon's points. I think you just have to listen, step back and take a look at things. You have to be comfortable to understand what your management looks like and how you want to change it and action that work. But generally for me, I think the female leaders in my team have been hugely important to our success.
Yeah, absolutely. And just on that, I think COVID has really brought to light even the simple discussion of things like burnout and, what working mothers are having to go to. I know you're speaking a bit specifically for Go City, but just across the industry as a whole, have you seen strides being made around work-life balance, burnout, things like that? What are you seeing industry-wide and perhaps what could be done better to better address that?
I think the pandemic put an enormous amount of pressure on women in general. I mean, when it was time to homeschool, more women were jumping on and teaching kindergarten on top, myself included, on top of doing Zoom calls in between. And I think many of us experienced that firsthand, and that led to a higher rate of burnout, which Coney showed in her presentation. Generally speaking, with the pandemic as a whole, I see it across the industry that burnout exists, and we just have to tackle that as almost a separate topic, or layered on top, I guess would be the best way to put it.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's almost yet another barrier against women for them getting to the top, because they're addressing that on top of their job demands, on top of their family and everything else. And Simon, I'm curious your perspective on burnout generally and work-life balance and what you're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the frustrating thing, isn't it? It's like a chicken and egg situation. You want to kind of break down some of the barriers some of the structural barriers that women face in order to progress in the workplace. But then women always end up disproportionately having to do so much of the damn care. And that's kind of a lot of the challenge, isn't it? I think for me, one of the most important things that you can do, I think, particularly in this particular area, rather, is you have to look at the interaction between the genders. And this, for me, of all of the areas, is where engaging men in that conversation and solution is most important. So, for example, if you look at solutions like gender neutral parental policies, they're absolutely crucial. Getting men to kind of take more of the burden at home is really, really important. And having shared parental leave, gender neutral policies around that are really, really important. And also just raising awareness and getting men kind of more engaged and understanding the challenges that women face. But then also, Carrie, could not agree with you anymore about flexibility. Again, this is kind of the piece that I was talking about around the pandemic, is that we actually have an opportunity to embed greater flexibility in the work practices. And while I don't think that is an excuse to lump all the extra work onto women, I do think while we have a situation where women are doing more work than men, it does allow them to actually thrive in the workplace in the meantime.
Yeah, one thing I would just add to that really quick is, as women are able to move forward in executive positions, naturally men are probably going to take more of the homework, of the work at home, right? That's just the way it's going to work out. And we're already seeing that. And I think one of the things I am seeing in the industry that I'm really proud of is extended maternity leave policies for women, but also paternity leave policies for men. And I think I'm a huge advocate of that. I think it should be the kind of thing you could switch back and forth on. And I can see in the future where you could just flex that as well. The man could stay home with the kids, or the woman could choose to do so as well.
Completely. I mean, it is just such a difficult problem to solve because, within that kind of micro situation, often the decision is made because men are kind of earning more anyway. It's disproportionately earning more in that situation. So then often the decision can be, well, the man stays at work for longer. And then you just get this reinforced vicious cycle that goes on and on and on and on. It needs to be broken somewhere. And what businesses can do to contribute that, for example, with the shared parental leave policies that you mentioned.
Sorry, my computer cut out there. Okay. All right. So we're coming up on time here. So I do just want to wrap up with one question that Coney and I discussed a little bit as well, or she got into. And, it was really troubling to see that the share of respondents who indicated their organizations are taking no initiatives to increase diversity and inclusion has more than doubled since compared to 2019. Does that surprise you? I know we talked a bit about how it got lost in the business cases, but, are you hopeful we can turn that around? And how can organizations sort of bring that back to the fore to really make it a priority?
I think for the travel industry, it will, I hope that it will continue to evolve and move forward, that whole topic. As Coney mentioned, the travel industry was one of the worst hit industries because of the pandemic. So it was really just about keeping the lights on. And you see that, especially in the attraction sector where I work. A lot of people were furloughed the whole time. So how could you start a new policy when you weren't even in the office, right? So I think that's a piece of it. The other thing I would overlay is that, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the work is moving to tech. So a lot of the travel industry is becoming tech-based. And in that section, it's very hard to hire. So if you want to try to overlay trying to mentor and find diverse candidates when there isn't anyone applying, that becomes a really challenging piece of work. And I think we have to just muddle our way through both of those things. But focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion is important. We just have to keep pushing that forward as an initiative in the industry.
Yep. Simon?
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I mean, just coming back to my kind of framing around listening, learning, and acting. I don't know your industry inside out. Obviously, I've not worked in it specifically. I'm not an expert. You are. But what I would say is strongly consider the listen aspect of that. from an outsider perspective, I may be wrong, please correct me if so, there is a huge level of diversity in terms of the job roles, the industry, the type of businesses, etc., that sit within the industry. I think there needs to be, at the business level or maybe industry-wide, a massive listening exercise to understand the experiences of women from the kind of board CEO level to women that are often doing cleaning jobs in the hospitality sector that are often particularly marginalized in terms of their voices. I think this is one of the challenges, but the beauties around the sector is that there are so many opportunities depending on what your skills are, but often the power isn't always the same. And so in terms of listening, we need to keep our ears open, and we don't need to do it as a kind of PR exercise or, a kind of annual employee gathering survey or whatever it is. We need to really think that actually this pandemic has been crazy and everyone's had a very, in some ways unifying experience, but in many ways very, very different and exposing experience. So before we build back better, to use that phrase, and recover from the pandemic, we actually need to understand the true experiences, challenges, risks that women, including those of different identities and backgrounds, face, use those lessons, and then act on them.
Yeah, it's clear from the research that there is a lot of work left to do there.
Yep. Yes, I know. And we could keep talking about this for ages. I know there's so much to dig into that we didn't get around to even, but thank you, Simon and Carrie, so much for discussing this with us today. It was really insightful and gave a lot of our participants action items to go with. So thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it back over to Kimberly to wrap up our event today.
Great. Thanks a lot, Jill. Thanks.